I'm Olivia Carter, 27 years old, and my life changed forever at what should have been a simple family dinner in Seattle. The table was full of food my grandparents were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and everyone was laughing and chatting like any other festive evening. But then in the middle of it all, my grandfather leaned across the table, his gaze sharp and focused, and asked, "Olivia, the $300,000 I gave you after graduation, how did you use it?" My heart stopped. I froze, my fork slipping from my fingers as all eyes in the room turned to me. My parents and my sister Emily went pale, the panic on their faces unmistakable. In that instant, I knew something was terribly wrong. Before I dive into the rest of the story, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and be sure to hit like and subscribe if you've ever had to prove your worth when someone doubted you. I was raised in Seattle in a family that always seemed to favor the glitz and glamour over hard work and substance. My father, Daniel, was a man who valued success, but only when it came wrapped in luxury and attention. And my mother, Linda, followed his lead, always choosing the dramatic and shiny over the quiet achievements I worked so hard to build. From an early age, I knew my place was never at the top of their list of priorities. Emily. My younger sister always had the spotlight. She was the golden child, the one who earned praise for her social media posts, her Chanel bags, and her glamorous travel photos. While she got to live a life of ease paid for by our parents, I spent my days working part-time jobs, just trying to make ends meet as I worked toward my MBA. I didn't mind the struggle, but I quickly realized if I didn't prove myself, no one in my family would ever truly see me. They saw her, but they didn't see me. And the more I pushed forward, the more invisible I became. At family dinners, I'd try to talk about my business ideas or the latest project I was working on, but it always felt like the conversation would shift the moment Emily spoke about her latest sponsored trip to Europe or the brand new dress she'd received from some designer. It was a constant reminder that no matter how hard I worked, I was always going to be the quieter, less glamorous one, the one who wasn't worth their attention. Olivia's very smart, but she's just not as charming as Emily, my mother would often say, dismissing me with a smile while pouring my father more wine. Those little comments hurt more than I ever let on, but they also fueled my determination to build something of my own, a place where my achievements would matter, even if my family never acknowledged them. My drive pushed me to work harder than anyone else, and after graduation, while my friends were heading to New York for corporate jobs, I found an offer in marketing from a small firm in Seattle. But I had a bigger dream. I always wanted to open a cafe and bookshop, a cozy spot where people could come together over coffee and literature, a place I believed Seattle was missing. So despite the pull of a more stable path in New York, I decided to return home. I knew it was risky, but something about coming back to the city where I grew up felt right. My grandparents, especially my grandfather, had always been a beacon of stability for me, even though he hadn't provided much financial help after my graduation. Still, he'd always told me that persistence and vision could build something lasting, and I clung to that idea. The night before my grandparents' anniversary, my Aunt Helen sent me a message reminding me to come back to Seattle. My heart swelled with anticipation, knowing how much my grandparents had been looking forward to this milestone. But when I called my mother to confirm the details, she was unusually flustered. "Actually, Olivia, the party might be postponed," she said, her voice hurried. "Your grandfather's not feeling well, just a cold, so don't rush back." Before I could say much, Emily interrupted, her voice flat. "Yeah, just stay in New York. Grandpa said you don't need to bother coming." Something about the way they both spoke made my heart race. It felt like they were trying too hard to keep me away. Why? Why didn't they want me there that night? As I lay in my tiny New York apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I knew my grandfather better than anyone. If he had truly been sick, he would have told me himself, not let someone else make excuses for him. I couldn't just ignore the suspicion growing in me. I needed answers. The next morning, without another moment's hesitation, I booked a flight to Seattle. Something was waiting there, and I wasn't going to let my family hide it from me any longer. I arrived in Seattle late that afternoon, the city greeting me with its familiar chill. The taxi ride to my grandparents' house felt surreal. I kept replaying my parents' strange excuses, their hurried voices still echoing in my mind. Emily's flat tone when she spoke made me uneasy. It didn't add up. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but I had to see it for myself. As the car turned onto Queen Anne Avenue, the streets looked just like I remembered, familiar, yet distant. The house stood tall, regal, its stone walls holding memories of countless family gatherings. The gate, adorned with intricate floral ironwork, felt like the final barrier between my past and what I was about to uncover. When the driver stopped and I stepped out, the evening air was crisp, the kind that carried a sense of nostalgia. I had expected silence. Instead, I heard music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Something in my gut twisted as I walked closer. The house was alive with the sounds of a celebration, nothing like the quiet sickbed excuse my mother had given. As I approached the front door, my heart pounded harder, and I could feel every step dragging me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. When I entered, the scene before me was a stark contrast to the story my parents had painted. The grand living room sparkled under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, and guests mingled, toasting my grandparents for their milestone. I could see my grandfather, strong and vibrant, holding my grandmother's hand, both of them smiling with genuine happiness. The picture of health, no signs of illness, no reason for the hastily constructed excuse. My gift for my grandfather, a vintage Marantz record player, felt heavy in my hands. I had hoped to see him smile at it, to feel the warmth of family around me. Instead, the tension in the air was palpable. The moment I spotted my parents and Emily, everything shifted. Their faces froze. My father standing by the banquet table, his glass shaking slightly in his hand. My mother gripping hers so tightly that her knuckles turned white. And Emily, always the center of attention, had turned away so quickly, her discomfort clear. I stayed calm, though my heart raced. I greeted a few familiar faces and took my seat at the table. I had to stay composed, but I couldn't ignore the feeling growing in my chest. Why had they kept me away? Why did my presence seem to unsettle them so much? The lively conversation around me continued, but I felt like I was watching from the outside, as if I were in a play where everyone else knew their lines, but I had been left to improvise. That was when I knew the moment of truth was coming. And it would come from my grandfather, the man who had always been the cornerstone of my family. I hadn't been sitting for more than 10 minutes when his voice cut through the hum of conversation. Steady, firm, it rang clear and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Olivia," he began, his eyes never leaving mine. "The $300,000 I transferred to you after your graduation, how did you use it?" I froze. The fork in my hand slipped, clattering softly onto the plate. My breath caught in my throat. 1,000 questions flooded my mind, none of them making sense. 300,000. "What do you mean?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. The room fell silent. It wasn't just the question, it was the weight of it, the calm, cutting precision with which he asked. And then everything stopped. My parents, my sister, everyone around me staring at me with expressions that ranged from disbelief to quiet panic. "Olivia, you don't know what I'm talking about." My grandfather's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. "I transferred $300,000 to you after you graduated. It was for you to start your life, to build something of your own." I tried to respond, my mind racing, but the words didn't come. I was choking on the realization that something was terribly wrong. My father's face was pale, his gaze shifting nervously from me to my grandfather. My mother's lips were pressed together so tightly I could see the strain in her jaw. And Emily was looking anywhere but at me. Her eyes were wide, full of something I couldn't place. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't guilt either. It was as if she knew exactly what was happening and had no intention of getting caught. "Grandpa, I swear, I never received that money," I stammered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "I never knew about it. The only thing I've ever received from you was the scholarship you gave me before. That's it." His gaze never wavered, and for a moment the whole room was still. My heart thudded in my chest as the weight of the moment sank in. He wasn't asking to accuse me. He was trying to understand why I had no knowledge of the money that was supposed to be mine. "Did Emily receive it?" he asked, turning his attention to my sister, whose face was now a shade of pale I'd never seen before. It was as if she had been caught in the act, her whole body betraying her. Emily's voice cracked as she mumbled, I borrowed from the joint account Grandpa. I thought I could invest it, make quick returns, then pay Olivia back." The words tumbled out weakly, unconvincing, and the room shifted uncomfortably. I watched Emily, who had always been the center of attention, shrink in front of everyone. Aunt Helen, who had been quietly observing from the side, didn't hesitate to step forward. Her voice was sharp and clear. "Invest. I saw you shopping with Chanel bags, Emily. What kind of investment is that?" The room went cold. A murmur rippled through the guests, and I could see the shift in the atmosphere. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by whispers and uncomfortable glances. Emily's face went red as she tried to find something, anything to defend herself, but there was nothing. Her story was falling apart piece by piece. My mother, trying to regain control of the situation, stepped in quickly, her voice trembling with urgency. "Enough, this is something we can discuss at home. We don't need to make a scene in front of everyone." But my grandfather wasn't done. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp and final. "No, Linda. This will be addressed now here in front of everyone. This is about trust. I trusted all of you, and now I want the truth to come out." The silence in the room was deafening. The tension that had been building was now unbearable, and I knew this was only the beginning. The truth, the ugly truth, was about to be laid bare. I could feel it like a storm ready to break. And just then my grandfather turned to my parents with a question that hit me harder than I expected. "Did you know about this Daniel, Linda?" The silence in the room stretched long after my grandfather's words hit the air. My father's hands gripped his wine glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white, but he didn't speak. My mother, her eyes wide with panic, avoided looking at anyone. I could see her trying to gather the words, but they didn't come. The silence between us felt heavy, like something deep was about to surface, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. I glanced at Emily, who stood there, her face drained of color. She wasn't her usual confident, self-assured self. No, in that moment she looked small, vulnerable, like someone who had been caught doing something they couldn't take back. I could feel her desperation hanging in the air, but she didn't speak either. Her gaze darted around the room looking for some kind of escape. It wasn't there. When my grandfather finally spoke again, his voice was low, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. "Did you know about this, Daniel, Linda?" he asked, turning to my parents. His words landed like a heavy punch. He wasn't giving them a way out. He wanted the truth, and he wasn't going to let them hide behind silence anymore. My father didn't move, but I could see the tremor in his hand. My mother, on the other hand, seemed to collapse under the weight of it. Her head dropped, and she let out a shaky breath before finally speaking. "Yes, I knew," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought Emily would return it. It wasn't supposed to go this far. It felt like the ground beneath me had been ripped away. The shock of her confession hit harder than I could have ever imagined. Emily had taken the money, used it for herself, and my parents had known. They had known and had done nothing to stop it. My grandfather's eyes locked onto my mother, his disappointment cutting through the air like a blade. "You thought she'd return it." His voice was steady, but his eyes blazed with fury. "You allowed this to happen. You watched as she squandered what was meant for Olivia's future." Emily stood there trembling, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but no words came. Her usual bravado was gone, replaced by a childlike fear I hadn't seen before. The scene was unraveling before us, the carefully constructed facade my family had built over the years, disintegrating in front of everyone. Aunt Helen, who had been silently watching, finally spoke up. Her voice cut through the tension. "Invest. You call that investing, Emily. I saw you shopping with those bags. That wasn't investing, that was indulging your every whim." Her words hit with precision, each one a blow to Emily's already crumbling defense. Emily's face turned crimson as she tried to come up with anything to justify herself, but it was clear. There was nothing left to say. The truth was out, and the air in the room had turned thick with the weight of it. My mother quickly tried to deflect her voice, rising in a desperate attempt to steer the conversation away. "This isn't the time or place for this. Let's just go home and talk about it later. We can work this out privately." but my grandfather wouldn't let it go. His hand slammed down on the table, silencing her. "No, Linda. This is happening now in front of everyone. We've hidden too much for too long. The truth is coming out, and I want the whole family to hear it." My heart raced as I looked around the room. The guests who had once been engaged in lively conversation were now staring at us in shock. The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on our family. I could hear the soft whispers starting to spread. Some guests looked away, uncomfortable, while others leaned in, eager to see what would happen next. I felt a deep sense of betrayal, but there was something else too, a feeling I hadn't expected. It was a strange mixture of relief and clarity. Finally, the truth was being revealed. It was no longer buried in whispers and half-truths. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the silent observer in this family drama. I was at the center of it all, and the truth was on my side. The silence was broken when my grandfather spoke again, his voice filled with determination. "Emily, you have some explaining to do," he said, turning his gaze back to her. "But before you do, let me remind you of something. This money wasn't just about giving Olivia a head start in life. It was a gesture of trust that you've shattered." Emily stammered, her tears starting to fall. She looked around at the people in the room, her mascara running down her cheeks, and I could see the realization sinking in. She wasn't going to get out of this. There was no one left to save her. The tension in the room grew thick, the air so heavy that it felt like it might suffocate us. Emily was completely unraveling. She tried to speak, but her words were choked with sobs. I thought I could make it back," she managed to say. Though the words didn't hold the weight they once did, they sounded hollow, empty. My grandfather didn't even blink. "You thought you could make it back. You didn't just steal money, you stole trust, and you stole the future that Olivia could have had." The words stung, but they were true. I had worked so hard to get to this point, and all the while my family had been building this house of lies. Now it was collapsing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The room was filled with uncomfortable silence again as my grandfather pulled out his phone. He was calm, but his voice was steady and unyielding when he spoke. "I need the police at the Carter residence. There's been a misappropriation of funds." As he spoke, I saw the shock spread across my parents' faces. My mother, her hands shaking, reached for my father, but he didn't move. Emily stood frozen, her face pale and streaked with tears. In that moment, I knew things would never be the same. My family was shattered. My grandfather had chosen to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The night was no longer about celebration. It was about justice. And as I stood there, I realized I was no longer the invisible one. For the first time in years, I had the power to shape my own future. The police arrived not long after, and the rest of the evening unfolded in a blur of questions and awkward silences. The guests began to filter out, many avoiding eye contact, the murmurs of scandal already spreading through the neighborhood. I sat there numb, unsure of what to do next. The night had ended, but the battle was just beginning. How would I move forward from here, and what would become of my family now? The police arrived shortly after my grandfather made the call. The entire room fell into an unnatural quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after something irreversible has been said. My parents, both visibly shaken, barely moved. Emily, her makeup smeared from tears, stood frozen, her face pale, a far cry from the confident influencer everyone had once admired. I was still sitting at the long table, numb, unable to fully comprehend what had just unfolded. The storm had hit, and everything I thought I knew about my family had shattered in front of me. It was almost as if I were watching someone else's life play out, one where my family was suddenly exposed raw, and no longer the picture of the perfect family I had always thought them to be. The police officers were polite but firm. They spoke to my grandfather first, asking a few basic questions to confirm everything was in order. I could see him holding his composure, his face unreadable as he answered their questions. The officers then turned to my parents and Emily. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each word they exchanged. I felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that the truth was finally being brought to light, but I couldn't ignore the bitter sting of betrayal. How had it all come to this? As the evening dragged on, the guests slowly began to filter out their faces, a mixture of shock and discomfort. I overheard whispers as they left, some full of sympathy, others tainted with judgment. I didn't care about the whispers. At that moment, I was more concerned about the sudden void between me and the people I had once called family. I could see it in their faces, the guilt, the shame, the realization that they were now exposed for what they truly were. When everyone had left and the house had fallen quiet, my grandfather sat down beside me. He didn't speak for a moment, just sat there in silence, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't in years: comfort. "I know this isn't easy, Olivia," he said finally, his voice steady. "But sometimes the truth has to come out, no matter how much it hurts." I nodded, but I couldn't find the words. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to thank him for his support, for standing by me when no one else did. But instead, all I could feel was the deep ache in my chest, the kind that comes from realizing that the family you thought you knew was nothing more than an illusion. The people who were supposed to have your back had betrayed you, and for what? A few moments of indulgence, Aunt Helen had stayed behind, watching quietly from the sidelines. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with both sadness and resolve. "I've never been proud of how they treated you, Olivia. You've always deserved better." Her words cut through the fog in my mind. Better. I hadn't really allowed myself to think about what better might look like. But now, as I sat there with my grandfather and aunt, I realized something important. I was finally seeing my family for what they truly were. And that was something I couldn't unsee. As the days passed, I continued to feel the weight of the betrayal. The phone calls from my parents were few, and they always ended with the same rushed apology. My father never asked about how I was doing, never offered to make things right. It was as if the truth had been too much for him to bear. My mother, though, was different. She called every day, apologizing, crying, telling me how sorry she was. But nothing she said could erase what had happened. Emily, on the other hand, avoided me completely. I didn't know if it was shame or fear, but she disappeared from social media and stopped coming around. I couldn't blame her. What could she say to me? I wasn't sure what I could say to her either. The damage had been done, and no words would fix what had broken between us. A week after the incident, my grandfather called me into his study. He had arranged for the will to be rewritten. The vast real estate investments that had once belonged to the family were now solely mine. The house on Queen Anne, once my family's pride and joy, would be passed down to me. I had mixed feelings about it. The property held memories, both good and bad, and now it would be mine to carry forward. "You don't have to worry about them anymore, Olivia," my grandfather said, his voice steady, as he handed me the revised documents. "They've made their choices, and now they'll live with the consequences." The weight of the decision settled in. I wasn't sure I was ready for this kind of responsibility, but there was no turning back. The family I had known was gone, and with it a piece of my past. But now, for the first time in years, I had a future that was mine to build. The following weeks were a blur. My parents' legal troubles continued. Emily's future, once so bright, had been irrevocably changed by her actions. The property that had once been a symbol of family success was now a reminder of all the betrayal. But through it all, I found solace in the support of my grandfather and Aunt Helen. They were the only ones left who had never let me down. They were the ones who still saw me, the real me, not just a shadow of someone else's expectations. They gave me the strength to keep going, even when everything felt like it was falling apart. As the months passed, I moved forward with my plans to open the cafe bookshop. It wasn't just a business venture. It was my chance to create something real, something built on my own terms. My grandfather and Aunt Helen both helped me with the details. My grandfather, always so careful with numbers, made sure I had the right financial backing. Aunt Helen helped me pick out the best books to line the shelves. I poured everything into that space, into making it more than just a cafe. It had to be a place where people could find more than just coffee. It had to be a refuge, a place of hope, a place where trust wasn't something to be taken lightly. The days that followed the night of the police visit were long and filled with a kind of heavy silence that seemed to cling to everything. My grandfather kept to his word, and the legal battles that ensued were relentless. My parents, despite their apologies, seemed to have retreated into a space where even the smallest conversation felt impossible. They weren't speaking to me in the same way anymore, and I wasn't sure if they ever would again. I couldn't just pretend like everything was normal, because it wasn't. In the weeks that followed, I found myself spending more time with Aunt Helen and my grandfather. They were the only ones who hadn't turned away the only constants in a world that had turned upside down. We started focusing on my cafe bookshop project more seriously, and in some strange way it became my anchor. I could pour all the confusion and hurt into creating something that was entirely mine, something that no one could take away. But even as I worked, the shadow of what had happened loomed over me. Emily's disappearance from my life was the hardest part. She didn't call, didn't reach out. The bright social influencer who once filled every conversation with talk of her travels, her designer bags, her luxurious life had disappeared from social media entirely. It was like she'd been erased from existence. I couldn't help but wonder where she had gone, what she was doing, if she was regretting her decisions. But I didn't have the energy to chase her down. I knew deep down that the rift between us was too wide to bridge now. My parents, too, seemed to retreat into themselves. I'd find missed calls from them on my phone, but when I answered, the conversations were awkward, strained. My father never asked about the cafe or anything going on in my life, and when he did speak, it was in a low, almost defeated tone. My mother was the only one who tried to keep up the charade of normalcy. She called often, always with tears in her voice, apologizing again and again for the pain they caused. But I couldn't bring myself to forgive them, not yet. Not until I could understand why they'd allowed it to happen. It was my grandfather who helped me find clarity, though I wasn't sure at the time if I truly understood the weight of what he was offering. After everything had settled down, he invited me into his study, a space filled with old leather-bound books and the faint scent of wood polish. He sat down across from me, his face stern but kind, and he handed me a set of documents. "I've made some decisions, Olivia," he said quietly, sliding the papers toward me. "I've rewritten the will. Everything I've worked for, the house, the real estate portfolio, it's all yours now. I'm leaving it to you." I looked down at the papers, the weight of them pressing heavily on my chest. The house on Queen Anne, the place I had grown up in, the place I had once hoped would be a symbol of family legacy, was now mine. The truth of the matter was, I didn't want it. I wasn't ready for it. But my grandfather had made his choice. He wanted to protect me, to make sure no one could take anything else from me. I thought about my parents and Emily, about everything that had happened. I had no desire to keep the property, not with all the pain it carried. But there was something else, a deep sense of duty to my grandfather, who had always been there for me, even when my own family hadn't been. "You don't have to worry about them anymore, Olivia," he said, as if reading my mind. "They've made their choices. Now it's your turn to make yours." It wasn't just about the property. It was about a new life, one that had been forged in the fires of betrayal. My grandfather was giving me the chance to build something, to step into a future that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. It was the most powerful gift he could give me. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and planning for the cafe. I started to feel a sense of ownership over my life again, something I hadn't felt in years. I spent hours at the cafe location, sketching out ideas, imagining the kind of place I wanted it to be. It wasn't just a business. It was a statement, a reflection of who I was and where I was going. No more hiding in the shadows, no more being overlooked. But as much as I threw myself into the work, a part of me still struggled with the loss of my family. My parents had fallen silent, and Emily, she might as well have been a stranger. I kept thinking back to the good times, the memories of family dinners, holidays, and the laughter we once shared. But all of it felt distant now, like a dream fading into the past. I couldn't just forget about them. They were my family after all. But I also couldn't keep living in the wreckage of what had happened. The betrayal, the lies, it was all too much. And yet, no matter how many times I replayed those moments in my head, I couldn't bring myself to forgive them. Not yet. The cafe started to take shape in ways I hadn't expected. The local community embraced the idea, and people who had heard about the project began to stop by, offering words of encouragement. It wasn't just a place to grab a coffee. It became a space where people came together to share ideas, to find inspiration. It became something bigger than I had imagined, something rooted in honesty and hard work, the kind of foundation I had always craved. But even as the cafe flourished, I knew the battle with my family wasn't over. The police had been involved, the legal ramifications for Emily, and my parents were still ongoing, and the fractures in the family were permanent. There was no going back. One afternoon, as I sat at the counter of the cafe watching the rain fall gently outside, Aunt Helen joined me for a cup of coffee. She had always been my rock, the one person who never wavered in her support. "Olivia," she said softly, her voice filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes with age, "you're doing the right thing. This cafe, it's your future. It's your choice. You've built it with your own hands, and no one can take that from you." Her words settled deep in my heart, and for the first time since everything had come crashing down, I felt a sense of peace. I was building something new, something that could never be stolen. And as long as I had my grandfather and Aunt Helen by my side, I knew I had the strength to keep moving forward. The weeks that followed felt like a long, quiet drift. I poured myself into the cafe, pouring out all my frustration, confusion, and hurt into the space I was trying to create. It was the only thing I could control. Everything else felt too big, too overwhelming to face. But the cafe wasn't just a business. It was something deeper, something more personal. It was my way of building something real, something I could stand behind, even if everything else in my life seemed to be falling apart. Every morning I would wake up and head to the cafe early before the rest of the world stirred. There was something soothing about those quiet moments, the aroma of fresh coffee beans, the sound of soft jazz playing in the background as the city slowly came to life. It gave me peace, a brief respite from the chaos in my mind. Aunt Helen was there most days too, helping with whatever needed to be done. She'd pore over the books with me, keep me company during the long hours, and most importantly, never once questioned what I was doing. She understood. She didn't need to offer advice or words of comfort. She just showed up steady and constant like she always had. But even with Aunt Helen's support, the ache of betrayal never quite went away. My parents continued to retreat into their own world, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a shattered family. Every call with them felt like a tug of war. On one hand, there was the weight of their apologies, their endless attempts to explain themselves. On the other, I was still so angry. I couldn't just forget what they'd done. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine. Emily's absence cut the deepest. It was as if she had simply vanished from my life. No more social media posts, no more calls, just emptiness. I kept wondering if she was regretting everything, if she understood the damage she had caused. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at her to demand answers, but the bigger part of me knew I couldn't go back. There was too much hurt, too many lies. One evening, a few weeks after everything had settled, my father showed up at the cafe. I hadn't seen him since the day everything came to light, and seeing him standing there in the doorway was like seeing a ghost of the man I once knew. He looked older, tired, and his usual air of confidence was gone. There was no longer any pride in his posture, just shame. He stood there for a moment as if he wasn't sure whether to come in. I watched him, my heart pounding in my chest. When he finally stepped inside, his eyes met mine, and I saw the weight of everything in them. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice cracked. I'm sorry." For a second, I almost didn't know what to do. His words sounded sincere, but I had no idea if I could believe them. I had spent my whole life seeking his approval, fighting to be seen, only to have him turn away when I needed him most. "I don't know what to say, Dad," I replied, my voice steady, but cold. "You've said it all already." He looked down, avoiding my gaze. "I know I messed up, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted you to know I'm sorry." The words were heavy, and they hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. We sat there in silence for a while, the tension between us thick and uncomfortable. I could feel the weight of everything he hadn't said, everything he had failed to do. But then he spoke again, almost like a confession. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly. "I don't know how to fix us." I had no answer for him. I didn't even know what I needed from him anymore. A part of me wanted him to beg for my forgiveness to somehow make it right. But I knew that was never going to happen. The damage was done. I had to find a way to move forward without him. I think we've both lost too much for it to ever be the same, I said. My words were quiet, but there was a strength in them I hadn't expected. The truth had already settled inside me. He nodded, his eyes closing for a moment, as if the realization finally hit him. When he opened them again, they were filled with a kind of helplessness I had never seen before. "I understand," he whispered. "I just wanted you to know how sorry I am." The conversation ended quietly. He didn't ask me for anything, didn't try to make excuses. He just left, and I stood there for a long while after he was gone, letting the weight of the moment settle over me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was spinning with everything that had happened, everything that was still left unsaid. I kept wondering if I had done the right thing by pushing my family away. But I knew the answer. I had no choice. There was no room for them in my life if they couldn't respect me, if they couldn't treat me with the care I deserved. The next morning, I went into the cafe early. It was one of those gray Seattle mornings where the rain fell in steady sheets, the world outside muffled and quiet. Aunt Helen was already there, sipping her coffee and flipping through a book. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes soft with understanding. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, though the ache in my chest didn't go away. "I don't know," I said, my voice quiet. I think I'll be okay. Eventually." She didn't push. She didn't need to. She just smiled and patted the chair next to her. "You'll get there, Olivia. One step at a time." And for the first time in a long while, I felt the tiniest flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything all at once. Maybe it was about learning how to take those small steps forward into a future where I could finally be at peace with myself, with my choices. But there was still more to come. The story of my family wasn't finished yet, and neither was mine. Months passed and the cafe began to take on a life of its own. Carter's Corner, as I had named it, became a hub for people looking for a warm drink, a good book, or simply a place to breathe. It wasn't just about the coffee. It was the atmosphere, the sense of quiet understanding, the feeling that people could let their guard down. My dream was becoming real, and every day it felt like I was building something stronger than I'd ever imagined. Even with the success of the cafe, I couldn't entirely shake the weight of the past. The rift with my parents was still fresh, still raw. I hadn't seen them in months. They didn't try to reach out anymore, and I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. Emily was gone from my life, too. I didn't expect her to come back, but part of me still hoped for an apology. It wasn't just the money, it was everything. The years of being ignored, overlooked, and overshadowed had left me with a kind of quiet ache that I didn't know how to fix. One evening, about 6 months after everything had happened, the door to the cafe opened with the familiar jingle of the bell. I glanced up from behind the counter, wiping my hands on my apron, and froze. Standing there, looking uncertain and out of place, was Emily. She wasn't dressed in the usual glamorous clothes I was used to seeing her in, no designer bags or high heels. Instead, she wore a simple sweater and jeans, her eyes downcast, looking almost like a different person. She hesitated, looking around the cafe, her gaze finally landing on me. "Olivia," she said softly. Her voice had lost its usual confidence, and the way she said my name was so different from the way it used to sound. It was almost a question, like she wasn't sure if I'd even recognize her anymore. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to turn away to pretend I didn't see her, but the other part, the part that still remembered the sister I once had, wanted to reach out. I took a breath and walked toward her, feeling every step like it was a decision. "Emily," I said, my voice steady but guarded. "What are you doing here?" She looked down, shifting uncomfortably. I don't really know," she said, her voice small. I needed to see you." I wanted to ask why, what could possibly have brought her here after everything that had happened, but instead I gestured toward an empty seat. "Do you want to sit?" She nodded, and we sat across from each other at a small table near the window. The cafe had quieted down for the evening, and the only sound was the soft hum of the lights above and the distant murmur of traffic outside. For a long while, neither of us spoke. It felt like we were both waiting for the other to break the silence, but I didn't know where to start. She wasn't the same person I remembered. She wasn't the Emily who used to command a room with a smile. This Emily seemed fragile, broken in a way I couldn't quite understand. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with something that almost looked like shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've been terrible to you." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Her apology felt empty, like she wasn't really acknowledging everything that had happened. She had taken the money, she had lied, she had stolen, and she had broken my trust. But here she was, apologizing like that was enough. Was it enough? "I'm sorry too, Emily," I said, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "But sorry doesn't fix everything." She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know what came over me. I thought I could make it work, that I could fix everything if I just took control, but I didn't. I just hurt everyone. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't just the money. It was the years of neglect, the years of being made to feel like I didn't matter. I wanted to scream at her for everything she had taken from me, from us. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there in silence, letting her words hang in the air. I was so caught up in the things I thought would make me happy," she continued, her voice trembling. "The followers, the brands, the parties. I thought if I could just have it all, I'd finally be someone. But I'm not. And I've lost everything, including you." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her that it was too late, that we could never go back. But another part of me, the part that had loved her like a sister, wanted to hold on to something, anything that we could salvage. "Why now?" I finally asked. "Why come here after all this time?" She looked down at the table, fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "I couldn't keep running from this, from what I did, from what you deserve. I just couldn't anymore." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment I wasn't sure how to process them. Did I even want her back in my life? I wasn't sure. The betrayal still stung. The hurt hadn't gone away, and I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive her. But as I looked at her, really looked at her, I saw someone who was lost, someone who had broken apart under the weight of their own mistakes. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Emily," I said, my voice steady but quiet. "But I'm not the same person I was before." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she wiped her eyes and nodded. "I understand. I'm just glad you're not pushing me away." I sat there for a moment, the silence between us thick and heavy. There was no easy resolution. There was no magic moment of reconciliation. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let her destroy me again. She could only take so much of me before I stopped letting her. I stood up slowly, ready to move on. "I need to get back to work," I said, giving her a small nod. "But if you want, we can talk more. I'm not saying we're going to fix this today, but I'm willing to listen." She smiled faintly, a sad, understanding smile. "I'll be here, whenever you're ready." And with that, she left the cafe. I didn't know where things would go from here. I didn't know if there was even a chance to rebuild what we had. But one thing was certain: I wasn't going to hold on to the past anymore. What was done, and the future was something I was going to build on my own terms. I don't remember exactly when the change happened, but somewhere between the quiet mornings at the cafe and the long conversations with Aunt Helen, I started to let go of the anger. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy. There were still days when I would catch myself thinking about my parents and what they had done, and the pain would come rushing back. But over time, I began to realize something important. I couldn't keep living in the past. I couldn't keep holding on to all the resentment. I had always been the one trying to earn their love, trying to make them proud, and in doing so, I had ignored my own worth. The truth was, I didn't need their approval to be who I was. My family might have failed me in ways that I couldn't ever forget, but they couldn't define me anymore. That was the lesson I had learned the hard way. Emily never came back. I didn't expect her to, and maybe that was for the best. I had seen her at her lowest, and I realized I couldn't fix her. She had to do that on her own. The decision to cut her out of my life wasn't made in anger. It was made in self-preservation. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us the most, and it's okay to step away from that. My relationship with my parents was a different story. It wasn't that I had forgiven them, it was more that I had reached a place where I could accept the broken pieces. My father's apology had been the start of something. Not reconciliation, but at least an understanding that we had both hurt each other. He might not have been the father I wanted, but he was the father I had. My mother, on the other hand, remained distant, unable to face what had happened. I didn't chase her anymore. I couldn't. The cafe, though Carter's Corner, was something real, something I had built on my own. It wasn't just about serving coffee. It was about creating a space for people to gather to find solace, to connect. It had become a part of me in ways I hadn't expected. The more I put into it, the more it gave back. People came, shared their stories, laughed, cried, and found a little bit of peace in the chaos of their own lives. And in turn, I found my own peace in that. I often sat there in the early mornings, the quiet before the world fully woke up, and I reflected on how far I had come. Not just in building the cafe, but in building myself. I wasn't the person I used to be, the person who waited for validation from a family that couldn't see me. I had learned that my worth wasn't tied to their opinions. It was tied to my own efforts, my own resilience, and the strength to keep moving forward. One evening, as I was closing up the cafe, I heard the familiar chime of the doorbell. I looked up, expecting it to be one of the regulars, but instead it was my grandfather. He had stopped by more often recently, and I was always grateful for his company. He walked in slowly, looking around at the cafe with a quiet smile. He had become my anchor in this new life I was building. "Evening, Olivia," he said, his voice calm and steady as always. He sat down at his usual spot by the window. "How's the cafe doing?" "It's doing great," I replied, walking over to join him. "I'm actually thinking about expanding soon, maybe opening another one." He chuckled softly, a proud twinkle in his eyes. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "Yeah, I have." He paused, looking out the window for a moment before turning back to me. "You've made your own way, Olivia. No one else could have done what you've done, and I want you to know I'm proud of you." The words felt like a balm to my soul. I had heard them before, but hearing them from him after everything that had happened meant something different. It wasn't about what I had achieved. It was about who I had become in the process. For so long, I had craved validation from the wrong people. I had sought it from my parents, from Emily, from the family who never saw me for who I truly was. But in the end, it wasn't their approval that mattered. It was mine, and I had found a way to give it to myself. As I stood there, the cafe softly humming with quiet conversations, I realized that I had finally come to a place where I could forgive, not because I had to, but because I had let go of the need to be healed by others. My family might never be the same, but I had learned to build something better, something stronger. The rain outside had started to pick up, tapping lightly against the window. I looked out at the city, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. There was still a long road ahead, and the scars from the past would always be there. But I knew that I had the strength to keep moving forward. Because in the end, it wasn't about the past. It was about what I chose to make of the future. And that I realized was the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the hardest battles we face are the ones we fight within ourselves. But no matter how hard life gets, we always have the power to choose how we move forward. If you've ever faced a challenge, a moment where you had to choose yourself over everything else, I'd love to hear your story. Feel free to share it in the comments below, and if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Life may throw us curveballs, but the strength to rise again comes from within. Take care, and remember, you are enough.